Welcome to this webinar. Before we begin the presentation, I want to provide you with a few housekeeping items. On your screen, you will see a taskbar with icons. Each icon is assigned to a particular element of today's webinar. After the webinar is over, please take our survey to tell us how we've done. Throughout the presentation, you can network with others or submit questions to the speakers in the box next to the slides. Download resources from the folder icon. Today's event is being recorded and archived and will be available within 24 hours. For on-demand questions or comments, send us an email by clicking Email Us. If you experience any technical issues today, please refresh your browser by hitting F5 for a PC or Command R for Macs, or email webinars@bmpmedia.com for one-on-one support. And now I'm excited to turn it over to today's moderator.
Good afternoon, and welcome to this webinar, Preparing for an Active Assailant Exercise Design Series. This event is brought to you by Security Magazine, and it's sponsored by Everbridge. I'm your moderator, Diane Ritchie, Editor-in-Chief of Security Magazine, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We're very excited about this presentation. Today's presenters are Regina Phelps and Annie Azrari. Regina is an internationally recognized expert in the field of crisis management, exercise design, and continuity planning. Since 1982, she has provided consultation and speaking services to clients on 4 continents. She is founder of Emergency Management and Safety Solutions, a consulting company that specializes in crisis management, exercise design, and continuity and pandemic planning. She conducts more than 100 exercises per year for her large multinational clients. Annie is the Director of Product Manager at Everbridge. She's responsible for the vision and strategy of Everbridge Open and safety connection products from Everbridge. Annie also works with technology partners to help build integrated market offerings that solve complex problems for customers and provide automated workflows. So just one quick note before we get started, please go ahead and submit your questions throughout the program. Our presenters will address as many as possible after the presentation is over. Today's event is being recorded and archived on securitymagazine.com for you to share with your colleagues and friends. And now I'll turn over the presentation to Regina and Annie.
Great. Thanks very much for that kind introduction. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. We're all, unfortunately, very familiar with the term active shooter. That term, of course, is specifically defined as a person or persons actively engaged in killing or attempting to kill individuals using a gun. This 2-part webinar series really pivots, if you will, and casts a wider net and a broader lens by focusing on the term active assailant. The weapon is not specified because, of course, it could be a gun or it could be many other different things, such as a knife or an explosive device, or as we saw this week in Toronto, a vehicle. The key difference between active shooter and active assailant is that the weapon is not specified. And as our threats continue to expand, the active assailant term is perhaps more accurate and maybe more appropriate. This subtle but critical nuance could actually make the difference in how we organize our thoughts, our plans, and our training. So let's take a quick look at my agenda here this morning. I'm talking about a variety of things, and I have a lot to discuss today, so I'm just going to dig right in here. So again, starting with the issue of definitions, we are moving away from this term active shooter, and what does that really mean and why? Well, first of all, I mentioned this in my opening comments, but the active shooter term is just a little too narrow in focus. And actually what it does for many of us, it creates a little bit of tunnel vision. In other words, we're always looking for the gun. So we tend to forget, because we've labeled it, that there are other real risks and other types of attacks. And we certainly have seen that. Use of cars in particular have been used repeatedly in the last 18 months. Knives, bombs, Molotov cocktails, many different vehicles in addition to guns. So what I'm really encouraging you to think about is there's no one-size-fits-all approach to this kind of response that we need to create. And it needs to be a combination of things. And so the traditional run, hide, fight may be the best answer, but maybe not. And so I guess what I'm really asking you to consider is it depends. So when you look at the definitions, active assailant is somebody who's using some sort of weapon and many types of tools to actually kill people in a populated area. An active shooter specifically references a firearm doing exactly the same thing. The term mass shooting, which now you see all over in the media, is defined as 4 or more people that are being killed, and they're often selected indiscriminately. Now, some people define mass shootings as including the perpetrator in that number of 4, and others do not. So there's a little bit of a variance there. And then lastly, workplace violence. And this includes verbal threats, physical violence, and the use of guns. Now, of course, and this is something I'll be talking about at the beginning of this webinar, is workplace violence could lead to an active shooter. It could lead to an active assailant. And our belief is that you can't just focus on active assailant, active shooter. You've got to focus on workplace violence, a plan and a program. And we'll talk about that. So these 4 issues go hand in hand, all 4 that I've mentioned. And so I want you to be thinking with a broad lens as we talk through designing an exercise today. So just briefly, let's look at how bad the problem is here in the United States. Now, I work and travel all over the world. I work in 4 continents. And I will tell you that no one in the world has a problem like us as far as shooting and violence in the general population that does not involve war or specified gangs. 2017 was the deadliest year for mass shootings in the United States, and 2 within about 35 days of each other are the most significant. The Las Vegas massacre, of course, we're all very familiar with on October 1st, with literally 58 people being killed and over 500 injured, the deadliest mass shooting in the United States now. And then the Texas shooting, which was about 35 days later, of which we had 26 churchgoers who were killed and 20 injured. But there's also lots of other statistics that I would ask you to think about. So there's actually, believe it or not, a Bureau of Fatal Statistics, and they produce every year a census of fatal occupational injuries. And you can Google this. I'm not making this up. Can you imagine having that on your business card? And this is what the statistics are for actual violent deaths at work in 2016. The vast majority of the injuries that were committed by a person were done by shooting, as you can see by looking down my list, but there was also other ways that people were trying to kill each other. There's also self-inflicted injuries that occur, and then there's also injuries that are unintentional or with the intent unknown. And I would encourage you to actually Google that because it gives you some good statistics to look at, and just by Googling the Bureau of Fatal Statistics. Now, to that end, there's also other statistics to look at, and you can just see how the number of gun incidents in the United States continues to grow. And these are the most current statistics going up to 2016. And you can see that a number of gun incidents was about 58,000, pretty significant. And the deaths continue to rise as well. You'll notice down at the very bottom the number of active shooters, and that's, again, as defined by the FBI. And you'll notice when you think of what you might think of as active shooters, the number is actually quite maybe smaller than you might imagine. And the statistics only go through the middle of 2016, still on the FBI website. But still, they continue to grow as well. And one more statistic I'd like to point out to you is where these actual incidents are actually occurring and also what they're caused by. So when you look at this particular slide, you're going to notice right away where are some of these homicides coming from. And the biggest numbers are either a domestic violence situation or a robbery. But there's also, as you can see, coworkers, inmates or detainees, and also students, patients, or customers or clients. The vast majority of these homicides are people that are known to us, not the person who walks off the street randomly to kill folks. And also notice where the gender issues are, that a vast number of homicides at work are women. So why is it important to stop and understand these statistics before we even start here today? The most common reason violence is going to come into your workplace is not a random person. And I think sometimes when executives will call us and say, oh my gosh, we have to do a active shooter exercise because we're concerned about people just popping in from the street. I try and really stop and educate them that that's not how that's usually going to happen. It's going to be somebody that you know or a threat that you've already heard about. And these threats primarily are in 5 areas, and I know that I'm speaking to many professionals in this webinar that already know this. Number 1 being robbery with a criminal intent, customer-client issues, which could be disgruntled individuals, frustrated people. Think of the YouTube shooting that occurred just last month, not very far from our office here in San Francisco. Worker-to-worker violence, so an employee, a contractor, or a manager. Domestic violence, where the worker is affected, but that partner comes into the workplace. And then, yes, ideological violence, such as extremists or value-driven groups that are actually justifying their belief by this case of violence. The issue of the statistics, though, is important because it tells you what you need to know as far as designing an exercise. And much of the workplace violence is actually targeted at women. So I want to just briefly talk for a moment about our introduction into workplace violence. So as my bio suggests, I'm not a security professional. I'm a professional crisis manager. And we had a client to actually 101 California, way back in 1993, where a man came into one of our clients' offices, Pettit and Martin, on the 34th floor of 101 California, pulled out 2 guns and began to shoot people. He actually moved throughout the 34th and 33rd floor using external stairwells. 8 people were killed, 6 others were injured. This is 1993. This was out of the blue. People were shocked. Now, I have to say that Pettit and Martin did all the right things. They actually worked closely with their employees. They worked closely with their customers. But what happened to them was something that has to do with the impact of these kinds of events. Now, the gentleman actually committed suicide as the police closed in on them. But despite doing all the right things, Pettit and Martin, which was the 5th largest law firm in the state of California, did not survive, and they actually dissolved 2 years later. They could not emotionally recover from having 8 people killed at work. And so since that time, going back to 1995, we actually started doing workplace violence workshops and talking about things like active shooter before that term was created back in 1997. And people had thought we'd lost our mind, but of course now it's actually commonplace. So before I get into all the issues related to exercise design, this is an opportunity for all of you to tell us something about you. What I'd like to hear from you is what types of workplace violence are you seeing in your workplace? And you can choose any or all. So are you seeing physical assaults? Have you had the use of guns? Have you had other weapons? Have you had things such as death due to violence at all in your workplace? And so I'd like to just give everybody a moment to vote here, and then we're going to stop and see what it looks like, because I'd like to sort of have you share anonymously, of course, what's actually happening in your environment. So we'll just give you just a few minutes to actually drop in some of your responses, and we can see what's happening. So currently right now we're seeing, and I'll show this to you in just a moment, a physical assault being so far the biggest one we've seen, followed by use of other weapons, followed by guns, and then actually some people having deaths occur at their workplace. So let me just advance this. I know we still have people polling, but if you have a moment, please jump in quickly and make your selections and hit the submit button, and then we'll have the opportunity to see what people have. So just as a quick glance, I know other people are still submitting their answers. The number one reason that looks like it's winning the contest is people have had physical assaults at their workplace. Others have had the use of weapons. There's been some guns, and unfortunately, there's been some who have had death at work due to violence. Thank you very much for sharing that. I appreciate it. Gives us some sense of who's on the call. So what I want to spend my time today talking about is how to develop an active assailant exercise. As my introduction implied, we design a lot of exercises in my company. I design personally about 100, and I spend probably 25 out of those 100 every year about the issue of violence because it is so pervasive in our world. Now, when you look at the basic issue of the guidelines on how you design an exercise, let me just say a couple things about that. Before you even begin, what you need to do is, first of all, you're going to need some senior management support because things will be revealed in this exercise that are going to make a lot of people super uncomfortable. So you need to make sure that everybody is on board. Ideally, hopefully, you've already got a workplace violence policy and plan and program in place. And if you don't, That's going to be the number one finding that you're going to find in your exercise. If you don't have one, of course, it's still not a deal breaker. You need an exercise design team. And a design team, by how we view exercises, is a group of probably somewhere between 3 to 9 employees, sometimes more, who are going to help you develop and write injects. And I'll explain all of that in a bit. And then ideally, from a timing perspective, you need about 90 days plus to do a really good job of designing a good exercise. Certainly, you could do it faster, but I really encourage people to take the time to really work it through so you can actually make sure you've covered everything you need to and have been thoughtful in your response. Now, there are 2 options you have when you're designing an exercise scenario, and I'm going to talk about each one of these. Now, one option you have is what's called the scenario before the perpetrator is eliminated and captured, so before the police arrive and up to the moment that the perpetrator is dealt with. If that's the kind of exercise that you're electing to do, then what you're doing is truly an emergency response exercise. Because all of us on this call know that when a shooter is in your building or somebody who has some sort of weapon, your primary activity is going to be hiding underneath a desk or running or hiding or fighting, but you're going to be responding. That's what's going to be happening. So that's really what we're looking at when you have an exercise that's before the perpetrator is eliminated and before the police have taken over. The second option you have in designing an exercise is one after the perpetrator has been eliminated or captured, and at that point the exercise focuses completely on impact, the impact of the event on the organization and the people. And that's going to have 3 primary focuses, all about crisis management, all about crisis communications, and all about business continuity, because that's what you're dealing with is the impact of this particular event. So if you decide, gosh, I still really want to do option 1, I will just say to you, and this is my personal opinion, that for the vast majority of businesses, a full-scale assailant exercise, so bringing in a SWAT team with guns, is not appropriate. I think it's difficult to conduct in an office or a warehouse or a manufacturing facility, and it is fraught with peril. There's a tremendous opportunity for confusion, miscommunication. People might think it's real. There's trauma for people that have violence in their daily lives. And as you've seen probably through the news, we've seen numerous lawsuits because of these exercises where people were truly traumatized thinking it was a real event. There's also some new research coming out about schools and doing school training with actual SWAT teams, the trauma that's causing on kids. So I am not a fan of doing this within a business environment. If the point is doing a shelter in place or evacuation or both, you can do that without having that kind of exercise, and I'll give you a suggestion about that in just a moment. I do believe that if you're going to do this type of option, there are 2 environments that are very appropriate, healthcare and education. My background is a hospital administration, so I was a hospital administrator for about 7 years, and I certainly in an emergency rooms, that would be a perfect example of where it would work in a healthcare setting, and certainly in the classroom. Now, if you're going to do option number 1, you want to do option number 1, I would encourage you to think about doing a concise and well-crafted classroom or office training, of which the first thing you're going to do in that training is you're going to review your company's workplace violence plan and policy, how people report threats, what happens when they do that, what are the policies in place for protection, super important. Then to talk about what you would do in an actual active assailant situation, and really reviewing the classic run, hide, and fight. And then when we've done this type of training, we actually break people up. We actually take them into rooms. We talk about how they could barricade a door. We talk about how they could actually fight using tools that were around them, talking about where they would go and how they evacuate. So you can make it super active and super engaging, but you don't have to do a SWAT team approach. Scenario number 2, that's where we spend 99% of our time and the exercises that we design, and that's where we're talking about the issue of impact. So when you have an impact-focused exercise, it starts after that acute emergency phase is over, after the perpetrator has been removed. The police are on scene, and the exercise clock really starts at that point when that person, that threat has been removed. And at that point, the exercise focuses on aftermath. And you can imagine what that is. What about your employees? What's happening with them? What about human resources? How are they going to support not only the employees, but contractors and family members. What about communications? And that's both in the traditional and social media space. How are you resuming your business? How are you dealing with the brand and reputation impacts of having people killed or shot at your facility? Those are huge issues that we need to really spend time peeling back. You can do this in any one of these 4 types of exercises: a basic tabletop, an advanced tabletop, a functional exercise, or a full scale. And for the purpose of our conversation today, what I'm going to really focus on is I'm going to really focus on this concept of a basic tabletop. So before you even begin the design process, you have a very important job. And that important job is that you need to, first of all, ask some questions and listen. And what I would encourage all of you to do is, first of all, develop a list of key managers and executives to interview about what they want to get out of this exercise. And so when you look at that particular thing, I always start with what I call the silly little question. I've written 3 books in exercise design and many different college classes, and I always tell people this is the silliest little question, but it will tell you everything you need to know. Because if you ask the question, why are we doing this? Or in another way, what do you want to get out of it? You will find out everything you need to know about this exercise that you're designing. And your job then is to basically sit back and listen to what they're going to tell you. Because this question has all the keys to the kingdom. So when you actually ask this silly little question, what do you want to get out of this? That's going to tell you right away the scope, which is who should be playing in this exercise. It's going to tell you the goal, which is the overarching issue about what you want to get out of it. It's going to clearly tell you the objectives about how you're going to actually focus the exercise. And then it's going to give you a really good idea what your narrative should be. And if you design an exercise without actually nailing this down, you will not meet expectations. I'll just tell you that right now. So the questions you're going to hear back from people as they're talking about this, and you continue to ask more questions, is going to really help you. So, for example, the kind of things that you're going to see are going to be something like this. You might hear when you ask the question, what do you want to get out of this? They may say, gosh, I really want to make sure the threat assessment team has gotten the opportunity to convene and assess the problem and make some initial decisions. Great, that told me right now I have to have a threat assessment team process as part of my exercise. Or you might have a communications person that says, I want to know how we're going to manage social media, how we're going to manage traditional media, and how we're going to actually communicate our status. You might have HR who wants to know how they're going to deal with employees. How do I get hold of my EAP? What can they do for me, et cetera? How can you communicate with your staff, and what would you say to them, and how do you account for them? Or they might say, I want to know if our business continuity plans are going to work in this particular incident. That's told me a ton of stuff. And now I'm going to design an exercise that's going to nail every one of those things. And that's what you want to do. So if you don't ask the question, you're not going to know exactly what's going to happen, what they want out of it. And so what those answers told me when I asked them is told me, first of all, if they want a threat assessment team, that means, what I'm probably going to do is I'm going to design a narrative where maybe what happens is the threat assessment team either meets that morning because of a threat, or maybe even the night before. We do that often where they have to call into a bridge, hear what the scenario is, and they make some decisions right then. So that means that we can actually begin to practice in real time before the exercise ever starts. In communication, you can bet that we're going to produce news videos for this exercise. We're going to drop in a zillion tweets and Facebook posts, and we're going to make a lot of issues related to the media, both traditional and social, so they actually have to do messaging. Under HR, we're going to make sure that they really have thought about how they're going to reach out to their EAP and how are they going to be managing employees. And we're going to tell them, call your real EAP. Tell them you're in an exercise and ask them, how many counselors can you have on site right now? And what can you do with this virtually? So they'll actually do that in real time. For staff communications, I want them deploying their emergency notification systems as a test. I want them to actually test their communication templates if they've got them, and I want them to show us what they got. And under their business continuity plans, I want to know, do they have this well figured out? Have they thought about critical customer needs, time-sensitive business applications? What are critical dates? What about equipment locations? What if staff don't come back for days and days and days, which is what's happened in all of the issues we've had in our client population. And one of the things I didn't mention, I mentioned the 101 California event, of which we had 8 people killed that were a client of ours. But in the last 20 years, we've had 47 murders. So unfortunately, we have seen how this plays out, and it's so challenging on the impact side, and most organizations are not at all prepared. So now what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask another question of all of you. So take a moment and look at your screen. I want you to answer the question, why do you want to do an active assailant exercise? So check every one that applies. So do you want, is it because management is concerned? Because you've had threats? We've had employees or others who have concerned us in the past. We have employees or others who concern us right now. And maybe none of the above, it just seems like a good topic. So if you take a moment and actually start to drop in your answers, you can check any that apply, and then we'll give you just a moment to see what sounds good to all of you. So our answers are beginning to come in. So far, the one that's winning, and I'll show them all to you in just a moment, is that management is concerned. And I will tell you, I often have that as being one of the primary drivers for many of our clients who call us, that a senior person within an organization has expressed a lot of concern. The second one that's winning the race here right now is we've had other employees or others in the past who have concerned us. Some people have had threats, and also some people are just saying it sounds like a good topic, which is great. So I'm going to give you just a few more minutes or a few more seconds here, if you will, and then I'm going to show you currently what our results are, and I know that some of you will still be submitting as we go forward. Okay, let's take a look and see what we got. Okay, so you can see so far on our list, pardon me, management being concerned is the biggest driver so far. But then also we've had employees and others in the past who have concerned us. Number 3 on our list is that those, none of the above, but it sounded like a good topic. People have expressed they've had threats, and they've also have employees right now or others that are concerning them. So those are all good reasons, and I encourage all of you to seriously make an effort to design this exercise, because I think it will super help you in many ways. So let's peel this back and talk about it. I'm going to talk about exercise development from essentially several ways. We'll talk about the scope, the goal, the objectives, the agenda, the artificialities and assumptions, the narrative, and the index. And I have a lot to talk about, and I'm going to try and cram it all in here as fast as I can. So the exercise scope, this tells you who's actually playing. And this is really important, because before you design an exercise, you need to make sure you're clear about who's playing, so that when you design the scenario and you design the index, it matches who is in the room. You also might have people that you simulate. So if you're doing an exercise and it only involves the communications team, you might be simulating other individuals. So you need to make sure that that you've clearly identified this. Very commonly when we do these exercises, it involves 2 groups. One is the overall crisis management team, and the second would be executives. If we design it for a specific business unit, it could either be, for example, for facility security, possibly communications. But if you don't understand who is playing, then you can't really design the exercise, because you don't know what to create. You don't know who's going to be engaged. So what the scope could look like in some of your documentation, maybe it's the activation of the crisis management team, and all other groups are going to be simulated. The second one example might be an executive management team is activated, and all other groups are simulated. And the third example might be something like the communications team is activated, and all other departments are simulated. So first of all, ask yourself the question, who's going to be in the room? And secondarily, do we have to simulate anybody else in order for this exercise to work? Once you're clear about the scope, you're going to talk about the goal. And because you spent time in advance asking the right people, what do you want to get out of this? This goal will be blatantly apparent to you. So the goal literally is the answer of the question, why are we doing this? So it's a very brief, clearly stated aim of what you want to get out of this. And along with the objectives, it keeps us completely on track. And these goals, if you will, are developed when you find out what the key players want to get out of this exercise. So that goes back to those interviews that you absolutely have to do. Now, examples of a goal could be something like this. And remember, these are the broad umbrella, arching umbrella that drives the exercise design. So one might be, I want to experience an active assailant incident that impacts the company headquarters and also its staff. Another could be assess the ability of the crisis management team to manage a workplace violence incident. Or another goal could be assess the readiness of the communications team to manage an active assailant incident. And for that third example, that would be if the scope, the players, if you will, were only the communication team. So you have one goal for an exercise, it's overarching in nature, and it drives the design. And then once you have that, then you can actually peel back and pull out objectives. Now, the objectives really, when we design an exercise, they are the guide that's going to help design and assess the outcome of this exercise. So if somebody says to me, the exercise is going to, I really want to focus on media, then one of our objectives will be focused on media. If somebody says, I want to make sure that we're able to actually access EAP, we'll have an objective related to that. If it's about business continuity, we'll have objectives related to that. So your interviews and asking this silly little question will write all of your objectives pretty much straight on. So when we look at this, what the objectives are going to do is they, first of all, establish the direction of the exercise. They actually control the inject, so it keeps us on point. We don't have Martians landing, as I often say in design. It keeps the scope pretty narrow, so we're delivering on what we've been asked to deliver on, and it keeps everybody, including the exercise players and the participants, all on track. And you also can use it to evaluate the exercise because we've actually been very super clear about what we want to get out of it. So the objectives are very important. Most exercises will have at least 3 to 5 objectives, and sometimes they'll even have very specific objectives for individual groups or departments. So what you might see if you're looking through a list of objectives, you might have one saying, okay, we want to make sure that we want to engage our threat assessment team, so we might have an objective that says activate the company's threat assessment team. And you could expand that to be much more in detail, of course. Account for all of the staff using the company's emergency notification system. Activate the company's EAP program. And I would just say to you, if you have EAP at your facility, I would really encourage you that you actually make sure that you actually have told them that they're going to hear from somebody at your in your exercise, and they actually call them in real time, saying, I'm in an exercise, and I want to know how soon could we get counselors, and what would they do, and so on. It's super important. Developing a communication strategy to manage the incident. Brief the company executive team on the incident, and assess the impact to the company using the business continuity plans. All examples of objectives. The third part of your exercise document, which is called an exercise plan, is the agenda. And the agenda is really important because what it does is it sort of tells you how your time is going to be spent. We believe minimally you need at least 2 hours to do any of this. I've had people say to me, gosh, we only have an hour. It's like, wow, what can you do in an hour? And I'll just tell you, not much. I think that most exercises ideally would be about 4 hours. And I'm going to give you some sample agendas here in just a moment to take a look at. And I'll just tell you why time is important. First of all, it takes time for people to wrap their brains around this. I know you're very comfortable with it because you've been designing this for a long time and you know exactly what's going to happen, you know what happens next. But these people just heard about it. And they have to wrap their brain around it. They have to try and make some good decisions. And you want to make sure they have the time. And now I also say don't advance the clock rapidly. So sometimes I've sat through exercises that other people have designed, and every 15 or 20 minutes they advance the clock. Now it's 2 hours later, it's 4 hours later. Well, I will just tell you that you're not helping them one bit. They never have to make a decision. They never have to solve a problem. They don't have to do anything except wait for you to advance the clock. You're not going to get any deeper knowledge. I would rather have you spend 2 hours with somebody in the moment and working through it rather than to advance it rapidly. And the thing about this is it gives the players an opportunity to really work the problem, and if it doesn't work, come up with another solution. You're trying to build deeper knowledge. We don't learn by plans, we learn by doing, and that's why an exercise is so incredibly powerful. So our preference is a playtime, an actual playtime of 2 hours, but we could live with 90 minutes if that's all we got. So let me show you some agendas here. I'm just going to quickly go through these. Let's say you had 2 hours for an exercise. Notice in this particular agenda, the first person who's going to speak, I want the most senior person in that company to actually do an introduction. And I want to talk about how important this is in the design. Then we're going to do the exercise for, in this case, about 90 minutes, do a debrief, and then the next steps. If you have a little bit more time for a 3-hour exercise, I would, first of all, if you have time, is really review your workplace violence program so people know what you have in place. Then do the exercise and then a debrief and the next steps. If you got a little bit more time, I would actually then do 2 exercises back to back. And I would split them with the first 90 minutes being the actual after the perpetrator is removed and while you're really just dealing with the aftermath. And then the second exercise right behind that, I might move the clock forward 4 hours, now really focusing on what do we do tomorrow and how do we continue and all of that. And then the last one I want to just show you, just to show you how you could spread this out and make it more interesting and complicated, just like the one I just showed you, but notice I added 2 things. An executive briefing, so where our incident commander who's running our event would actually be briefing the senior executives, and a press conference in which our folks have to get in front of a group of people that will turn into reporters who will ask them all kinds of questions. So they're really engaged and really pushing the comms team. You also need to look at artificialities and assumptions in an exercise. So what does that mean? It's a kind of a funny word, if you will. But artificialities are all those things that are blatantly not true. And we design exercises. We often do all kinds of things to make it more impactful. Pardon me. So we might change the date. We might change the time. We might say certain people aren't available. Or there might be other conditions that need to be in place for the exercise to work. So just because you're doing an exercise on a Wednesday on May 15th, that doesn't mean the scenario date has to be that. Pick a date that's more impactful and more challenging. And also you might need to have some assumptions. And those are the things that people may literally want to, they're already making up a decision about what's in place. And so you might need to have some assumptions as part of your exercise plan. So now we're just at the exercise narrative. So we've talked about a lot of things and we just got to the narrative. So the narrative is super important. Of course, it's going to basically be the beginning part of the movie or the story or the screenplay, and it basically prepares our participants for this exercise that we're about ready to conduct. It gives them everything that they need to know. So it describes the environment, provides all the necessary information, any background information that's important, and there's so many things that you could do. And of course, there's many angles. You could have a person who's been terminated. You could have domestic violence. You've got contractors laid off. You've got disgruntled employees. You've got managers who go off the deep end. You've got a random person off the street. I would just encourage you to look at even setting up things in Google Alerts about workplace violence and active shooters or active assailants. And just have that sent to you every day. Go to Google Alerts, put in your requirements for the search, and every day Mama Google will send you a whole list of exercises every single day, which is what you need to get started. And then lastly, are you going to have exercise injects? So when an exercise is designed, you start with a baseline narrative. And then what you do is you actually move the exercise along with what's called exercise injects. And exercise injects are those things that, again, you start with a baseline narrative, and then as you move the story along, you inject in new pieces of information. So think of an inject as literally the continuation of a story. Maybe they're like a chapter of a book, and they move the story forward, and that's what an inject is. And that's what your design team is going to help you to actually design. Injects usually ask people to do something. They want some sort of decision or statement or process. So they basically are getting people to do something. They can actually provide additional information, not often, but sometimes they can also just give people some FYI kind of information. For inject development, the injects really are the drivers. So you start with the baseline narrative, and the injects are constantly exposing things that are not resolved. They're always going back to the injects. So the objectives. So if one of the big objectives is social media, you can bet I'm going to drop in a zillion injects that are Twitter comments or Facebook posts, so that literally it will continue to move the story forward. And what we're trying to do is get the participants, the exercise players, to do something. And that's what the inject does. In a basic tabletop, you could deliver these by slides, or you can hand them out as individual notes to different people within the exercise. So I've talked about a bunch of stuff, and of course we're going to be really doing an exercise actually in a very short period of time, which we'll talk about in a moment. But before I do that, I want to just say a couple things about this type of exercise. And this is really a word of caution to everybody. This is a very significant event, and it was one that is fraught with a lot of emotional issues with individuals. Because I want you to stop and think about this. You have no idea who in this room has been impacted by violence in their personal life. And this, what I do is at the beginning of the exercise, I will basically start it out by looking at everybody in the room and say, this narrative involves violence. And I want you, in your personal experience today, to take care of yourself. If you become overwhelmed or you become anxious, step out of the room, take a deep breath, come back, because you don't know who in that room has been impacted. Do not assume that no one is, because the good chances are there are a percentage of people who have. So I also like to remind them that there's an EAP service, assuming you have one, so they understand that there are EAP options. Don't freak out your participants by running this exercise, because you'll have vulnerable people, and that's not smart. Now, we are going to conduct an exercise, and so I hope you're going to be coming back for this on June 12th at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. You're going to be an active participant in a webinar exercise, and you're going to get all the materials so you can actually take this home, if you will, and do it yourself. So before I pass this over to Annie, I have one more question, which is, are any of you that are on the call today planning to attend the June 12th exercise webinar? And you got 3 choices, yes, no, or maybe. So if you take a moment and begin to drop in your answers, that would be great. Now, I've covered a lot of material in a really short period of time, but what I would encourage you to do is really, at the end of this exercise, this webinar, you'll actually be able to access this information. I really encourage you to spend some really thoughtful time looking at these slides and really pulling together a good design team and really understanding why you're doing this. Because if you have those 2 things, a good design team to help you make sure you really nailed it, and secondarily, that you actually know why you're doing it, you will design a great experience. So let's see what our participants have said so far. I know I'm sort of rushing you. About 51% of you are coming back, and 43% said maybe, and 6% said no. All right. Well, and again, if you don't, then you can always access it virtually as well. So under a next steps perspective, before I hand it to Annie, let me just say this. And I know I'm speaking to the choir, but I think it's important. I really ask you to take this threat seriously. We all expect that it's never going to happen to us, but in the 47 murders that we've seen in our client population in the last 20 years, I will tell you it is devastating, devastating to the business and to the staff. I really encourage you to make sure you have a good workplace violence prevention program and plan in place, that you get strong executive support for this exercise, and that I ask you, I hope that you're planning to attend this June 12th webinar. So I'm going to pass this on to Annie, and feel free to follow me on LinkedIn, and thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Regina. Good afternoon, everyone. We would just like to take you through critical events management and how critical events management can help with active assailant or any other type of critical event that could impact an organization. We know that there are many events happening all the time. Active shooter or an active assailant is one type of that. There are other types like terrorist attacks. There could be natural disasters like weather-related events that could impact an organization, IT outages, and risks to travelers and local employees. So when we think about critical events, we kind of want to think about it holistically, as Regina stated earlier, and we want to think about what are the things we really care about. The things we really care about are our assets, our people, our buildings, our supply chain, our IT systems. And the risks that could really impact these systems, they could impact the life safety of our employees, or they could disrupt our business, are things like workplace violence. There are things like natural disasters, Hurricane Katrina, a great example of that, and more recently, Harvey. So there are a number of things that could impact your assets, and when these risk events collide with your assets, that intersection is really a critical event where an organization needs to respond and take certain actions to eliminate those risks. What we are seeing in the across many different organizations is that organizations are faced with a lot of noise. They're getting a lot of data. News is constantly showing what risks could happen. Social media is showing them what risks could possibly happen. They may be using some curated risk event feeds as well. But organizations are traditionally in silos, and these risks are not communicated across. They don't have the right tools or the right groups to react or even prevent these types of risks to the organization. As a result, you have life safety issues, you have business disruptions, and our goal, our mission at Everbridge is really to keep people safe and businesses running faster. So we have designed our critical events management to help streamline some of that crisis management workflow that organizations are struggling with. So what is critical events management? Critical events management is about assessing the risk, having the ability to see all the risk that could impact all of your assets, be able to locate all the impacted people, impacted services, impacted locations, but also be able to locate the people who can resolve the issue. So I need to be able to find my response team, and I need to know who is affected by an incident. Then I need to be able to act. I need to take some actions by communicating the right information to the right groups, giving the response team the right information, and also giving the right information to the affected people. Maybe provide them with floor plans. If there's an active shooter scenario, give them the right information, run, hide, fight. Here are the floor plans. These are the exits you're going to have to take, etc. And then finally, when a crisis is over, I want to do some analysis and understand how can I improve my standard operating procedures. So in a nutshell, our critical events management platform is the tools that give you situational awareness. It gives you visibility into the location of your employees, your travelers, your lone workers, and it gives you the tools to act by communicating the standard operating procedures to your teams, activate run books, and mitigate and eliminate threats. And finally, do analysis. All of this should happen in a visualization interface so you can quickly get an idea of where everybody is. So the first phase is assess. I want to see all of my local employees. I want to see all of my buildings. I want to see all of my travelers, but I also want to see all the risks that's coming in and which one of these risks are in the vicinity of my assets. These risk events can come from many different sources. They can come from a weather feed. It can come from a social media feed. It can come from a curated risk event feed, for example, International SOS. So once I have this information, once I have assessed the situation, I'm going to be able to locate all of my people. I'm trying to advance the slide, and this one is advancing. Our apologies. Vanya, would you be able to perhaps go to the next slide, and I'll just describe the goal here. So as I mentioned, after assessing the situation, you want to be able to locate all of your people, all the people who could be impacted, but you also want to be able to locate your response teams, not just based on their physical location, but also based on their on-call schedules, based on their certifications and expertise. You also want to have a visualization interface which shows you all of those people on a map. You also want your people in the field to be able to communicate back or share their location with the organization if they need help, for example. Maybe a panic button, maybe the ability to check in and let the organization where I am. The next step is to be able to act. So I have a crisis, I need to be able to resolve the situation, what are the actions I'm going to take? At this point, I want to be able to activate an automated workflow, an incident communication workflow, where I can simply send out my standard operating procedures. I can notify the right people. I already have my escalation rules in place. I have my contacts and groups. I can simply select the building that or the location that is impacted, and I want to quickly gather the responses and be able to ask my constituents whether they're safe or not and capture those responses. So when on the map I see that there is a risk event happening, I can simply choose the right template and activate the appropriate workflow for that scenario. The next step is really about analysis. I want to be able to have the tools that tell me what percentage of my population have responded to my notification. How quickly was I able to resolve my crisis? What was the time between when I was notified of an event and when I was able to take action? Who are the teams that respond fastest to a crisis? Those are all important data points that help me improve my standard operating procedures and be able to resolve the incident much better next time. So I want to have a dashboard that gives me all of those pieces of information. Now, the critical events management platform is designed around communication and collaboration. Occasionally, I may have to pull all of my response teams onto a conference bridge and allow them to discuss next steps. I want to also at the same time keep all my stakeholders in the loop. Maybe I need to keep my PR team or my legal team in the loop because they're getting calls from the press and they need to respond with the appropriate message. So brand management becomes critical. When something like the shooting at YouTube happens, the person responsible for PR needs to immediately be in the loop. The legal team needs to be in the loop. So those are all the different stakeholders and constituents that need to receive the message, but they don't all receive the message that the response team receives. So I want to be able to collaborate and communicate the right information. The critical events management platform is really a SaaS platform, a true multi-tenant SaaS platform with a set of common capabilities, the ability to communicate over multiple modalities globally, and provides a visualization interface that shows all the risks and all the assets. It also has the ability to get information from dynamic locations and not just show people's static location, because we know people are on the move and people are no longer limited to their office space. They're going to be traveling between buildings on a campus. They're going to be traveling for work, so we need to have their dynamic locations. We also need to be able to manage plans and be able to send out those crisis plans at the right time. So those are all the different applications that live on top of the platform and leverage those core services and serve three key use cases: employee life safety, business continuity and resiliency, and IT-related incidents, as well as supply chain. So here you see a little description on all the different products. We have our visual command center, which is really our visualization interface. This is where you see all of your threats, and you see all of your assets, and you see the proximity, and where you can really take action. This is a great tool for GSOC. Our safety connection solution is our location-aware product, which allows our customers to see the dynamic location of all of their employees. And our incident communication module is really the automated workflow engine. Our mask notification module is the one that most people are familiar with, and it has the ability to communicate globally to over 200 countries on the map and have a redundant SMS gateway for every country on the map. IT alerting is really designed around IT incidents, and all of this lives on a highly available, scalable, redundant platform with a 24/7 support team that can even launch notifications on behalf of our clients so that they can respond to incidents faster. Here's a little glimpse of the critical events management platform and a quick slide on the background of Everbridge, which started out in 2002 with over 3,500 customers today, and the ability to send communication to over 200 countries on the map. At this point, I would like to hand it back to Vanya so that we can open it up for some Q&A.
Okay, thank you. We don't have a whole lot of time here, but I want to remind everyone that's on the webinar here to please continue to submit your questions, because I know that both of our presenters will be more than willing to reach out to you privately after the event is over. One question that came in is about your opinions on safe rooms. How do you think that what do you think about the use of those in a workplace environment?
Well, I'm assuming that's directed to me, so I'm happy to take it.
Yes.
This is Regina. Yes, I think safe rooms are an interesting concept, and I think it really depends on the business, let's say. So I certainly think that you should identify rooms that would likely be safe. So, for example, we have clients that we've walked through their facility to suggest to them which rooms would be safe. When you look at a safe room, there's also those that are actually professionally designed, where they are literally a space that is not easily discernible. I've seen those in executive offices, for example. I don't know that you need to go to that extent. It seems to me, based on your risk, of course it depends on your risk profile, how significant your risk is. But for the most average company that we certainly have worked with, and most of our clients are in the Fortune 500, I would not say that would be an appropriate use of funds. However, understanding what's a safe space in a building to be and pre-identifying those makes a lot of sense.
Okay. One question I'm thinking this also might be for you, Regina, is what is the percentage of companies that are not healthcare, school, or other public entities that are actually doing these exercises?
So that's a great question. So again, it depends on which exercise you're talking about. If you're really talking about the emergency response exercise where people are brought in with like a SWAT team, I will say that in our client population, and we work for about 1,000 companies, none of them are doing that. But in the area of workplace incidents where we're talking about the aftermath, I would say in our client population, we have done at least one in every one of them. And that's because people perceive the threat as being so great about the aftermath and how they would actually recover the business and take care of the people. Okay. Maybe another question for Regina is, where's the best place to hold a drill? So that's a great question. So I think what I would suggest is that when we do an exercise like this, remember what you're trying to get out of an exercise, you're trying to build capabilities and depth of knowledge. So what we'll often do is we'll hold those exercises in possibly the building that would likely have been evacuated. And what we'll say in the artificialities is you are not meeting, obviously you're in this space, but artificially we have you in a particular location. So when I design an exercise, I am really all about trying to build performance, build deeper knowledge, and an understanding. So I will often use artificialities in the exercise where we might still be in the building that likely would be evacuated, but just for the ease of people's ability to come to the exercise and be productive, we're just going to say that we're actually someplace else, and maybe it would be to their second alternate site. Okay. I think next question is for Annie. Up to real time is data updated? Is the data that's being updated manually input by someone, or are the feeds automatically fed into the system?
Yep, there are two sets of data. One is the asset data, and then the other one is the risk data. The asset data can come from an HR tool, or it can come from a client database, and it can 100% be automated. So a person does not need to manually upload the asset data. And that asset data includes buildings as well as individuals, employees, and contacts. Okay. The second set of data is the risk data, and the risk data comes in real time from many different feeds. It could be the weather feed, it could be a curated security feed, it can be social media like Data Miner or Twitter, and curated feeds like International SOS, NC4, Control Risk, a number of different sources for risk event feeds, which come in as soon as the data becomes available to that feed. Yep.
Okay. Just one last question for Annie. What integrations does Everbridge have that can help with active shooter preparedness and response?
That's a great question. Everbridge has a very large ecosystem of integrations. One integration that seems very appropriate is the integration with shooter detection systems, which actually shooter detection systems can put in little sensors in buildings and detect gunshots. Those gunshots will automatically come into the Everbridge those alerts come into the Everbridge platform, and the Everbridge platform can activate a workflow based on those. So very quickly be able to respond to that gunshot. It's called shooter detection systems. Other integrations that really help with this scenario are integration with Alertis and desktop pop-ups. So let's say you have people in a building and they're on the 5th floor and they didn't hear the gunshot on the 1st floor. They get the notification immediately through all of their modalities, including desktop pop-ups and digital signage and indoor sirens, etc. Okay. And all of that is provided by Alertis.
Okay, good. Thank you. We've run out of time, so thank you so much to Regina and Annie for your presentation, as well as our sponsor, Everbridge. This was really outstanding information here. As you all exit today, please take a couple of minutes and complete our survey. We really do look at those comments and we tweak things to make the experience better for everyone here. We'll have an archive of this on securitymagazine.com in a few days. You can forward it to your friends. And please make sure to join us for the next webinar, Active Assailant Exercise Design Series Part 2, and that will be on June 12th at 1 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time. So thanks, everyone, for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.